Greetings, friends. This is Michael Swain, Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, 4SA, and I'm here today with our Head of Legal, Liesl Pretorius, who is the genius who examines and analyzes all the laws and puts together all our submissions. And thankfully, we are a team that is pushing back in the fight for faith and freedom. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of Comprehensive Sexuality Education, known as CSE in public schools. And this conversation has been precipitated by the Department of Basic Education's release of their Basic Education Rights Handbook, which has a whole chapter on CSE. And it is evident that they intend to again push this matter into the public school system. So let's first of all just consider that South Africa in this context is pretty new to CSE. And for those who might not be familiar with it, CSE is part of the CAPS curriculum. It falls under the life skills and life orientation elements, and it is a compulsory subject. Sex ed is a compulsory component of life skills and life orientation. And so it applies in both the primary schools and in the secondary schools concept. And in 2011, the DBE started a process to strengthen, as they call it, sex ed by drawing on UNESCO, which is part of the United Nations International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, or ITCSE, which it then incorporates into Comprehensive Sexuality Education. There was a big push in 2019. The Department of Basic Education were given a 25 million, that's a R500 million grant by an organization called USAID, and they began to develop scripted lessons plans called SLPs, and a learner workbook and an educator's guide. And this comprehensive sexuality education program has already been rolled out in many, many schools in South Africa. And so obviously, this is a big concern because you cannot teach on sex and sexuality from a neutral perspective. And therefore, it is so important that parents know what's going on. So, Liesl, maybe you can tell us a little bit more. Why is CSE so controversial and what are the main objections to it?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I think the main objections to CSE are fourfold. Firstly, there is the explicit and graphic nature of some of the content of the learner guides and the books that will be used in the classroom. Then there are questions around the age appropriateness of content. Then a major concern, especially from a freedom of religion point of view, is that the content is not ideologically neutral. And you've alluded to that already. It's problematic when an ideological content is used in schools, because public schools should be ideologically neutral. And the ideology that is being pushed by CSE may very well undermine the beliefs and the values of parents who hold to traditional religious or cultural values. So that is problematic, and what in and of itself. But what makes this even more problematic is that in the development of these SLPs, the scripted lesson plans, and in the implementation, this was done without meaningful public consultation, which is a major concern. So those two concerns taken together, it's a major concern because first of all, you have ideological content, and we know that the department has an obligation to respect the parents to choose the religious and cultural basis of their children's education. And the content is obviously normative, value-laden, and they also have the right to be consulted, and they were not properly consulted. Then either the development or the rollout of the CSE content, and the department seems, in spite of all this, determined to push out CSE in South African schools.
Yeah, it's probably worthwhile reminding everybody, of course, that CSE is very much a freedom of religion issue. The constitutional right that we've been given, guaranteed, I should say, in Section 15 is obviously deeply entwined with the parental rights that you've mentioned, because, of course, parents have the right to transfer not only their faith, but their beliefs and their values to their children. And it is self-evident, or it should be, that what children learn about sex and sexuality at a highly and impressionable age and stage of their development will fundamentally and permanently affect their view on relationships and on marriage and on family. And of course, that in turn is bound to have a knock-on effect for future generations. And so this transfer of knowledge and values around sex and sexuality has typically and historically been left to parents. And traditionally, schools were limited only to teaching about the biological aspects of sex, which are, of course, are ideologically neutral. So, Lisa, why have we, 4SA, been involved in this? What are our main concerns?
Well, Michael, overall for SA, we have two primary concerns. The first is the truly woeful lack of process and transparency and the marginalization of arguably the two most important stakeholder groups, parents and teachers. Parents, because they have the inalienable right to choose the kind of education which is best for their children, especially the cultural and religious basis of education, as we have said, and teachers who will be teaching this. Teachers, as individuals, of course, also have the right to religious freedom. Then, secondly, a second primary concern is the complete disrespect for or at least negation of the rights of parents, which are based upon international law. We've got the Children's Act, we have relevant sections of the South African Constitution, the Department of Basic Education's own 1995 White Paper on Education and Training, which sets out the relationship between parents and the state in the area of education, setting out the rights of parents and the duties of the state in relation to those rights. The state is not there to usurp parents' rights. Um, and when ideological content like this is being taught to children, and also when parents are not being consulted, that is what the state is doing. But a little more detail on
Yeah.
our concerns. The lack of consultation, for example. Neither parents nor teachers, as the primary stakeholders, were adequately consulted. And this has been confirmed by more than one school governing body association and teachers union that we've spoken to. Then the lack of recognition of parental rights. We talked about binding international law, for example, that confirms that parents are primarily responsible for and entitled to educate their children according to their own beliefs and their own values. And this is confirmed in the White Paper on Education and Training of 1995, as I've said. And therefore, what this bears out is that the department must respect parents' rights to decide what is and what is not appropriate when teaching their children about sex and sexuality. We're talking about value laden content. We're talking not about the ideologically neutral, biological, mechanical aspects, but that also needs to be presented in an age appropriate way, of course. But we're talking about value laden, values about relationships and sexuality, and etc., etc. Then the lack of transparency. Parents must be given sight of CSE materials before these lessons are taught to their children. We wonder in how many schools were CSE rolled out, and parents were completely unaware of what was being taught to their children and are being
Yeah,
taught.
I mean, that was a big problem, of course, in America in the battle for the governorship of Virginia. It was actually effectively won because there was such an outrage from parents when they discovered what was being taught to their children. And I think, as I remember from the last time we dealt with this, one of the biggest challenges is that using UNESCO's own data, it shows that the implementation of this ITGSE based CSE in public schools actually harms children. And of course, the department should therefore be reviewing this content to ensure that it does meet their obligation under Section 28 of the Constitution to do things in the best interests of children. It's not just a sort of a cookie cutter, one size fits all that they can push into schools, because obviously contexts are different, values are different. So I think the other thing, of course, that we want to point out to parents particularly is that there are alternatives. There are well-respected curricula that deal with sex and sexuality. And the school governing bodies are the actual authority in each individual school that actually has the capacity to choose what materials to utilize to educate learners and even offer educational opportunities for parents on sex and sexuality so that their rights are not simply removed. And Lisa, tell us about what parents who maybe have a big problem with this can do. Can parents opt out?
Well, Michael, we are glad to confirm that the department has, in writing, confirmed, after, of course, public outcry and pressure, that CSE is not compulsory. So it really is up to the school governing body and parents to be aware of what materials are being used to teach the sex ed component of life skills or life orientation in the school that their child attends. The school governing body can choose an alternative curriculum for a particular school. They can choose to use the materials that were used before CSE. The material CSE materials were implemented in the school. They can use alternative values-based curriculums. And parents should also have the opportunity to opt out their child of specific classes that has content that they are not comfortable with. Because I think it's important to remember that LO is not a subject that counts towards university entrance exams, for example, or university entrances. So it's so parents can then take it upon themselves to teach those components of the curriculum so that your child does not miss out. You don't want your child to miss out, but teach them according to your own values. But that's why the school governing body is so important, because they are a gatekeeper in the school, saying that, this is not what these are not the values that our school community and our parents are comfortable with.
Now, of course, the DBE obviously argues very strongly for the teaching of CSE and, of course, the CSE curricula that it recommends in schools. But why do we disagree with their rationale? Because they do put a very strong case forward. They talk about teenage pregnancy, and they talk about children becoming sexually active, and they talk about essentially the irresponsibility of parents sometimes too, in how they teach their own children, or when they teach, or with what they teach their own children. They relate it to bullying. They relate it to gender-based violence. Can you give some of the reasons why we particularly are not convinced by these arguments?
Certainly, Michael, and the reasons put forward, the social ills that the department wants to address, and then the social challenges of HIV/AIDS, teenage pregnancy, etc. Those are valid concerns, but we don't believe that CSE is the right way to do it. And on the evidence, CSE may even do more harm than good. And this is also a call for parents, to step up. You've alluded to some parents who don't fulfill their role and duty. But on the scientific evidence, CSE is not that effective, and that's what the evidence shows. So UNESCO did a study in 2018, so it's its own study and its own CSE, and shows that this international technical guidance on sexuality education is not only ineffective at addressing these concerns, HIV/AIDS, teen pregnancy, STDs, etc., but in fact may do more harm than good. And in 2019, there was a midline qualitative report on the evaluation of school-based sexuality and HIV prevention activity in South Africa, which also evaluated the impact of these SLPs, and it shows little to no support for the SLPs. And then in 2019, there was a global research review which examines the evidence for CSE in schools and also found that the results were really lacking, and it was even worse in African schools. So when you look at this, we need to remind ourselves that the DBE has a constitutional duty to show that in the development and implementation of revised sexuality education content, or any education content for that matter, that what it does is in the best interest of children. It has a constitutional duty to uphold the best interest of children. And in looking at this evidence, in our opinion, the DBE has failed to do so.
Yeah, so I think just to summarize, obviously government has the right to set the minimum standards. That's what it does in the CAPS curriculum that it wants to achieve in basic education. But what it cannot do is it cannot enforce specific content, particularly with a topic like sex and sexuality that is obviously value laden. And they also have a duty, by the way, to respect parental rights, because parents, as you have said, have the inalienable right to choose the type of education for their children, particularly in the early years of schooling. And let's just mention briefly the ECE toolkit. That's one of the big problems we have about the teacher training of teachers to bring transgender ideology into pre-primary and primary schools. Very importantly, of course, the school governing bodies, they or you, if you're on the school governing body, you are the gatekeeper, in fact. You are the one who has the opportunity to select. And parents, you obviously have the right to know what your child is being taught. So check it out. Go and look at it. Go and ask the questions that you need to ask. Liesl, but obviously, given that CSE is, as you said, not compulsory, interestingly, it doesn't count towards your university entrance. Is it necessary? Why? For parents to remain vigilant against CSE?
Yes, Michael, I think especially if you're a parent who is a religious person or more culturally conservative, you need to remain vigilant against CSE. Or you just generally need to be involved in your child's education. You really can't afford not to be. But on CSE specifically, many parents in the school community, in your own school community, if you're a parent, they remain unaware of CSE, or they are unaware of what their rights are. So they might be concerned, but they don't know what they can do. So then it's important for you as a fellow parent or a concerned member or religious leader, cultural leader, to raise awareness and to educate parents about CSE, that that it does exist and what their rights are. For example, that it's not compulsory, that the SUB can um, use another curriculum as long as it confirms to the outcomes of CAPS, that children can be opt out of classes. Um, so it is concerning for us. So parents have options, and they have to remain vigilant because, despite legitimate concerns, and we've spoken about the lack of research evidence that shows that CSE is effective, and the evidence that showed might be doing more harm than good. The government, despite these concerns and despite the evidence, seems to be committed to promote and push CSE into South African schools. For example, in July 2020, South Africa and 9 other African nations, they signed the so-called Education Plus initiative, and this initiative was launched by 5 United Nations agencies in 2019. And in 2022, this agreement was ratified at a summit, a UN summit held in New York. And what this agreement effectively does, it gives full authority to the United Nations to overhaul sex education in traditionally conservative African countries. Because if you look at the world, Africa is the continent that has the most pushback against CSE because of traditional conservative values. But what this agreement gives authority to the UN basically to infuse this radical sexual agenda that is contained within the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education into the public school systems of these African countries. But again, it's important to also understand that this is not a binding agreement. So, but it is concerning that this is being pushed and that there hasn't been any sort of consultation. So that for that reason, parents need to remain vigilant.
Yeah, it is somewhat bizarre or even counterintuitive that there's a lot of talk about, decolonizing education, and yet here we are importing something so foundational like teaching children about sex and sexuality from a very liberal, very much a sort of a sexual rights approach. Very strange indeed. And so let's quickly look then at what parents can practically do to prevent their children from being exposed to CSE, obviously, that goes against their views and values. And I think we've mentioned, obviously, know what your child is being taught at school. And if you're not happy, engage. Have the necessary conversations with the school governing body. Look at these alternative sex ed programs that we've mentioned and the learning and teaching materials. And obviously take up responsibility personally for teaching your child about sex and sexuality. Lisa, what can schools do particularly? Well, what would be the responsibility on schools and teachers and of course on learners themselves?
Well, Michael, schools can also, even if the parents don't suggest it, consider alternative sex education programs and learning and teaching materials to use instead of the DBE scripted lesson plans. And I think the school should also inform the parents that this is what they're considering and about CSE. Um, I think that would be good if they exercise that duty. The schools can commit themselves to proactively uphold their duty parental rights and to act in the best interest of children. So that means involving parents so the parents know what is going on. And they need to let parents know what their children are being taught and involve them in the making process. And teachers, even if the school does not suggest it or the parents don't suggest it, the teacher themselves can consider using alternative sex education programs, put it to the school governing body what your concerns are, and that you have found an alternative program that meets the CAPS requirements, and that you think this program is more suitable. Um, and I think it's important that teachers also have the necessary conversations with the school governing body. And teachers also that they should remember that as an individual, you also have the right to religious freedom. Although if you work at independent school, it might be limited in that context. But keep that in mind. And if you are a learner in a school and you are being taught material that you're not comfortable with, firstly go to your parents, but also speak to your teachers about that.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've covered a lot of bases, and I trust that for those who are watching, this has been useful and helpful. Again, parents, know your rights, know what's happening in your schools, know what you can do about this if you're not happy. We trust you found this helpful, and we look forward to the next time. Please tune in to 4SA. We have our YouTube channel, which you're probably now watching, and go to our Facebook page, go to our website. Please donate and support us, because we are very, very dependent upon the voluntary contributions that you make to us financially, so we can continue to do this and continue to bring you this type of relevant and informative, constructive, we hope, element to the discussions that we are facing in our fight for faith and freedom. Thank you, and God bless.